why Fertile Crescent is the early cradle, if you will, of domestication of animals and crops. That could have been an accident as well. But this is an area where the rainfall improved, aridity went down, because now we have a relatively more moist period. Why? Your glaciers are slowly melting, they are going, they are retreating. So, with the retreat of the glaciers, you have more rainfall. Okay. So, that is one thing that does improve. Secondly, you have two other favorable conditions. One is you have the Tigris-Euphrates river flowing quite closely together and a large flat land around it. You also have here from the Mediterranean Sea some rain that comes here. Now, all of this means also that there is some water available which could then be useful for obviously agriculture. Now, in this whole region, there is the other advantage, which is that it's still not dense jungle. It's not too much of rainfall. It's still arid enough that there are scrub forests. They're not really dense forests. Advantage of scrub forests is they're easier to clear. So, this is the other reason that you will see almost all early examples of quote unquote civilization, which means really domestication of crops, animals, and then evolution of more settled populations ending up in cities. All of these you will see, the early ones, all of them come around rivers and essentially in relatively arid zones. As I said, one shouldn't generalize too much about it, but you can look at, for instance, just across in Egypt, again arid lands, Nile, river valley. So, you have access to agriculture, but not difficult in terms of clearing forests. Now, this zone, what now evidence indicates that agriculture grew in this entire arc, starting from here up to what would be called the Zagros Mountains in Iran. And this is the Anatolian region. And you also have, this is the Levant, what is now Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. Now, Levant, Anatolia, and Iran, all of these seem to show you have domestication of crops. And we'll come to what those crops are. But these crops seem to travel across the arc. So, this entire arc seems to show also a certain degree of mobility of people and crops. How do we see it? We see it in kinds of the crop strains that we see, because you can also see the germplasm of the crops also. That's also preserved. You can see also genetic evidence, what's called archaeogenetic evidence. All of these show that it is not that one group of people developed agriculture and those people took agriculture to this other parts of the Fertile Crescent, but there seems to have been a movement along this, which means that there were also groups of people who acted either for reasons of trade or because they were moving with their, shall we say, their herds, domesticated animals across, and they acted as carriers. So, this link tends to get underestimated, and that's why more or less we tend to think as if everything happened autonomously. But there is also a lot between settlements, settled people, settled population. There is a lot of exchange that is also going on, more or less depending on the kind of terrain that the caravans and the groups of people, mobile, nomadic people have to move. So, when you talk about what are these sites, all these sites are called pre-pottery Neolithic sites. More correctly, unless you have really fired those pots in kilns, raised it to a certain temperature, they don't call pots pottery. Okay, I would think you make a pot, bake it or you don't bake it, still a pot. So it's pottery. No. For the archaeologist stroke historian, it's pottery only when it has been raised to a certain temperature, not even if the pot is baked over a campfire, for instance. So these are therefore called pre-pottery Neolithic sites. You can see these are all pre-pottery Neolithic sites, and all these sites are therefore before you have what is called modern pottery and kilns, and coincidentally also, not so coincidentally, also writing. That comes later. But this, as you can see, a whole range of new tools also arise as you domesticate animal and crops. It seems to happen almost simultaneously. Some domesticate animals, some domesticate what would be called the grasses, and then over a period of time, I mean, you have in these communities, you also have some domesticated animals. It's not that just you are living in just raising crops. All of this means a huge change in human civilization, which is we now come into what are called settlements. Before these, before the formation, before agriculture, what we do is we move from season to season into different areas, depending on what nature provides in that place. So you really did not have the option to settle down in one place year after year. It depended totally where you could find food. Now you had semi-settlements. From each season you could move to one place, come back in the next year, season, again you could come back to that place. But you didn't really build quote unquote a village. What is different from the Neolithic crops, and we'll see what they are, is the fact that you start now storing what would be called seeds, both for food and next year's sowing. So what you are doing is you are creating the possibility of a surplus. That surplus you use for the seasons in which this production is not there, and also for next year sowing a seed. But it's nevertheless surplus at that point of time. What is well preserved is obviously not vegetables unless you have what's called pickling, achar. Unless you do that, you can't preserve vegetables. You can't preserve meat. You can dry it, keep it for some time, but still it doesn't have longevity. So what you can preserve well are seeds. They are hard. And incidentally, what we see as now cereals are really seeds, and a lot of them were really from wild grasses. In fact, they are from wild grasses. If you take wheat, rice, maize, all of them are products of wild grasses which have been domesticated, selectively bred, and you get what are called the modern crops. Now, if you take these as the early crops, this is this, and we're talking really at the stage of the Fertile Crescent. These are crops. This flax gives you oil as well as fiber, so you could use it for rope making, baskets, and of course also cloth along with skins. This is einkorn wheat. This is single corn. Single corn means that actually it has, all of us have two copies of chromosomes. Okay, so this is also two copies of chromosomes only. But then you get emmer wheat, which has 4 copies, and the modern bred wheat, which is what we all use now in large numbers, that has 6 copies of chromosomes. Now this does not happen in nature by itself. This is selective breeding. So our earliest farmers, Neolithic farmers in West Asia, did what we will call genetic engineering, but they did it by selective breeding. instead of doing it in the laboratory by transferring gene of one species or one strain to another strain. But if we think that nature does not change, or we have not changed nature, yes, we did. All these are not the crops we started with. And if you see pictures of ancient maize, which is what Americans call corn, now you will see that the cobs were this small. Okay. Now you can see the bhutta outside our office in winter, and it's this big. Okay. This is also the kind of selective breeding by the ancient farmers, not so ancient, only about 10,000–12,000 years back, that has produced the modern crops. Chickpeas, peas, lentil, this for the Indians are very familiar. We still eat all these things today. This bitter vetch, I don't know what it is. I'm told it's some kind of sag. But I would like you to look at the domestication of animals and see that yes, these are the animals which are domesticated today, are the domestic animals today. The cows are domesticated multiple times. If you see the wild auroch from which the cows come, I would really think that that must have been a very, very difficult exercise. Or if you take the wild pig, wild boar, from which the domesticated pigs have come. So even here in the animals, there has been a long range of, shall we say, selective breeding till we get the docile cows we have today. Okay, or we get the pigs that we are able to breed much more peacefully. I don't know about the wild sheep, whether they're as dangerous as the wild aurochs or not. But certainly the goats and sheep may not have been that difficult. But pigs and aurochs really were difficult to domesticate. Now, if we look at the founder crops map, you will see that Fertile Crescent is only one part. There is across Africa, across the Americas, Southeast Asia, East Asia, there are other crops which have been there. Rice is, of course, the most prominent one. We still don't know where it originated from. Probably from Southeast Asia, probably. But we still have not identified what we can say, yes, it came from there. And we won't get it till we have really archaeological evidence. But there is a large number of crops, and of course the number of crops we use today are much greater than what these founder crops were. But nevertheless, this shows that independent trajectories of development were there, depending on what kind of founder crops. But roughly this timing, these seem to precede, or these precede in their continents, precede other developments, mainly because these are also semi-arid regions, and therefore there is a sort of similarity to what we have already discussed here. And you will see later on, this is also the place where this crops, modern agriculture comes in. So again, as I said, where is Asian rice coming from? We still haven't uniquely identified, though this says it's here, China. But is it a mono origin, multiple origins? We still are not so sure, depending on whom you talk to. Indians seem to have done a couple of things which are from India. One, of course, is our bagan. This is definitely Indian, okay? They're what's called the eggplant by some, okay? We call it what? Brinjal, eggplant. So all of this is Indian. Aubergines, if you're too stylish, you can call them aubergines as well, okay? coconut seems to be Indian, mango seems to be Indian. So there are different varieties of lentils and peas which are also Indian. So there are different zones have contributed differently to what is the current basket of, shall we say, crops. This is a slightly different map of that. This is, we are now starting with where the urbanization is taking place, early urbanization. Now, what leads to urbanization? First is the potential for urbanization exists only when there is a surplus, because the urban population has to eat. There has to be surplus from other areas where agriculture is being done to transfer the surplus to an urban area. So it's a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition. We'll come to the sufficient conditions later. But the necessary condition is a surplus. And what Neolithic agriculture provides, bigger settlements, first time you're settling down in a place, bigger settlements. You also have the possibility of surplus, because some people then have to be set aside for doing certain tasks. And two tasks will become very important henceforth. One is the ability to predict the seasons. If you don't predict the seasons, you cannot do agriculture successfully. You have to prepare the ground before the seed is planted. You may plant it when there is rain, but you have to prepare the soil beforehand, not after. Quite often in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, you had to actually do engineering of the water so that you can prepare the ground. So you had to build dikes, protect plots, and then control release of water. So all of these meant that you had to release some people who would be doing not directly agriculture, but preparing the basis for agriculture, either in terms of prediction, other activities. So this is the wise men thesis, some wise men. Second is, the minute you have a settlement, you have the possibility of attacks by people who are not settled. They could be roving bands, there could be also nomadic groups who would see, okay, we need food, there's people have food, let's loot them. So you need people to defend. So you set aside a certain set of people whose only task is to build akhadas and do wrestling, okay? So become the muscle men of the village. So these are the things that you have to do. Then certain crafts. Now again, the craftsmen were also peasants. It's not that they were not. But they might have been given some special privileges because they were also good craftsmen. They could build better pots, better weapons, better implements for agriculture, and so on. So in this division of labor, the potential for division of labor is also based on surplus. Some people produce, some people do not labor as much or not labor at all in order to provide services the settlement requires as a whole. So again, potential for inequality. Without a surplus, everybody has to share, otherwise they die. Okay? It's not true the wise men, old men were left to die. Okay? They were also cared for because they had knowledge. It's not that pregnant women were left to die. Tribe had to reproduce, the group had to reproduce. So reproductive labor was recognized. But nevertheless, inequalities in this kind of societies is less because you cannot accumulate and you cannot pass accumulated wealth to others. So it's only amongst what you have, what you're producing currently, that some inequality can be there. Initially, because of knowledge and other services you provided. Later on, as we'll see, that it could also be transformed to provide a more permanent and hereditary basis, as well as basis of society being also in gender terms. That all these, what we call patriarchy, all of these, the potential arises when there is a surplus. When there is no surplus, it doesn't arise. So shall we say this is very bad because now we have surplus, we have all of this? I will say, look at the population growth. The Paleolithic population to Neolithic population, the growth is almost 10 times. So much larger population is sustained by agriculture. So why was the Paleolithic population low? They knew they couldn't sustain a large number of people. So they had to practice probably a degree of infanticide as well. That how much can a tribe sustain? They died in accidents. They're more healthy because it's other consequences I will talk about of settled agriculture, settling down in villages. But they also suffered a lot of injuries, and you can see it in the skeletons that we have, that lot of injuries, bones being broken, all of that is there in the hunter-gatherer stage of evolution. So both things come together, inequality but also development, larger numbers. So both of these come together. So the potential, this creates a potential for now a more concentrated, shall we say, settlement, which again there are certain prerequisites. One of this is that one of the consequences of settling down is also that the chances of infectious diseases increase. You're staying together, you infect each other. The second part of course, infection is waterborne diseases. And as you know, fecal contamination, in simple words, shit, is the cause of a lot of the disease. Cholera, typhoid, all of these are waterborne diseases. So having people stay in settlements mean that the growth of infectious disease. So all of that also happens. So this is why if you see population who are Paleolithic population, they were relatively healthier. Okay, they also had a more balanced diet in terms of what the human beings have been used to for 1 billion years, 2 billion years, the hominid population. So you're more used to that kind of a diet. Suddenly you go into cereals. Okay, so that's a different kind of diet. So how long does your gut bacteria, which is the most important element of your, shall we say, process of adjusting to new foods, of course that evolves much faster than you. So there you are lucky. It doesn't take 10,000 years for that evolution. For our evolution of 10,000 years, gut bacteria is probably 1 million years, because the numbers of generations are much, much faster than ours. They're much more short-lived. So given all of that, the Neolithic population in settlements actually have lived longer, but do not live as healthily